All right, welcome to another Psych 300 lecture. Today we're going to be going over lecture 4, the introduction to qualitative research. This is when we had our guest lecture come in and she kind of just yapped about cool shit for a while. So we're kind of just going to recap her lecture. I don't remember how to say her name. Last name is McConnell. She introduced us to qualitative research. So we looked at the aim of qualitative research, differences from quantitative research, key terminology and indicators of research quality, examples of qualitative methods, close-up examples of studies, and then we concluded. Okay, so we're kind of just going to go through all of those again. Yeah. So the aim of qualitative research, it focuses on context, experiences, and nuance. Essentially, when it comes to qualitative research, we want to understand how our environment and nuance and lived experience can play a role. Again, when it comes to, our environment, our nuance, and our lived experience can all kind of play a role in shaping data and shaping life. This is opposite to the fact that, for example, in quantitative studies, we want to control those variables to make sure they don't interfere with the study. Questions in scope tend to be much more broad in qualitative studies as opposed to strict relational comparisons between variables, which is what we see in quantitative studies. So, yeah, we want to conduct studies, gather data surrounding environment, nuance, and lived experiences, and something a little bit more. I'd even want to say, in this case, categorical actually works just fine, as opposed to something more numerical, tangible data, etc., etc. So, qualitative data is a lot about asking the why and the how, very focused on perspective, personal experiences, yada, yada, yada. Our goal is to develop an understanding, meaning, and depth. It's all about perspective and context and establishing depth through understanding the behavior of ourselves, of others, of what we're looking at. This can limit some of the biases that we see in quantitative research, for example, as the scope is so broad that it keeps people from trying to personally manipulate the experiment to give you what you want. You're very much at the whim of the lived experiences, the nuance of others. We see a lot more quantitative than qualitative research, though qualitative research is increasing. So that's a bonus, I suppose. Yeah. So let's get into it. Let's get into a little bit more of it. Some comparisons, qualitative versus quantitative. So quantitative, we've already looked at this a little bit, but again, we're looking to seek causal expectations and test hypotheses, right? Very focused on variable relationships about how and why things happen. It is a very narrow, controlled focus, completely free of context, and the environment is completely controlled, at least usually. We can get into that a little bit more later. We use controlled sampling, right? Random sampling. In quantitative research, you want your sample to represent the overall population. The case is the same with qualitative, except in qualitative, you kind of sample a little bit more purposefully, as opposed to like a strictly diverse sample. So quantitative, again, we're looking at controlled sampling. Its data collection is used in scales. It's using scales, very close-ended questionnaires, very very context-limiting data collection. It relies on statistical analysis and testable results. We know this. Usually, you make a hypothesis, you measure it, you test it. Qualitative is more about theory and narratives than measurable ideas and going forth with that. Researchers in quantitative are expected to remain distant and neutral, trying to control as much as possible. You will see that in qualitative that's a little bit different, and replicability is important in quantitative research. So quantitative, very controlled, very much about the numbers. We want random identical conditions. That way we can control our experiment even better. We don't want bias. We want we don't want bias at all, period, in anything. But data is very, very, very context limiting. It's very much about statistical analysis. Yeah. Qualitative, right? Qualitative seeks exploration and understanding. It's very data driven. You never really make a hypothesis in qualitative research, as you're not looking for anything in specific, but you make a theory because you're trying to understand or explain a thing or a construct. It's very broad, so it's more so just ideas, which is fine. Again, it's broad and it's context bound in its focus. Despite this, when it comes to how broad it is, we can actually look for commonalities between our study samples and wider populations, and how we can learn broadly from this. And there's a very contextual approach to its research, to try to expand it to wider society without necessarily having strict numerical data. So again, qualitative is very context bound, very broad. Um, and yeah, despite being context bound, we try to extrapolate as much as possible. We use purposeful and theoretical sampling, right? It's not random in qualitative. You really want to talk to the right people that would be able to describe the perspectives that you're looking for. You don't want absolute randomness across the board. Again, there's still a degree of random selection, in controlled sampling, but you don't want it to be absolute. Again, we're looking for something a little bit more specific. We use data collection is looking like interviews, observation, and stories, things that encourage depth and context awareness. These methods are very good at collecting groups for or data for smaller groups as opposed to data from lots of people, right? We can spend more time with less people. The analysis can take many forms in qualitative, right? Usually involves taking data through written text and more and assembling that into generalized data. We emphasize descriptions and narratives and building theories as opposed to direct testable results. And the researcher is directly involved. Interpretation and reflexivity matters with that. So the lived experience of the researcher can matter. In quantitative studies, the researchers, again, they aim to minimize their involvement. In qualitative, it's very much the opposite. We want to reflect on our involvement. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of how quantitative versus qualitative research can be compared as far as as far as sampling goes, right? Quantitative, we want it to be absolutely random. Qualitative, there's a little bit more of a narrow focus there. There can be in quantitative too, but if you let's say you step a step forward in narrowing the randomness in quantitative, you would want to take that an even extra step forward in qualitative. Quantitative, again, very numerical, very controlled sampling. Statistical analysis, the research is very neutral, very distant. Qualitative, it's the opposite of all that. Very context bound, very broad, seeking exploration and understanding through theory, data-driven analysis as opposed to something that's more of a hypothesis-driven analysis. It's not as much statistical analysis as it is, depth of experience and reflection. The researcher is directly involved, yada, yada, yada. Bias. There's always going to be bias in research, like we talked about a little bit, but both will have researcher bias when it comes to quantitative and qualitative, but qualitative is very transparent about who the researcher is, how they're involved, what they're looking for. They embrace and reflect on the bias while doing their best to keep it as minimal as possible. Ultimately, there's room for both methods. Use what you want to, use what you want based on what you need to understand, right? Research questions should drive the method selection, depending on the questions that you're asking, the thing that you're looking at. That's when you would use different methods. So key terminology. Three things: epistemology, ontology, and reflexivity. So epistemology, epistemic means something to do with knowledge. Epistemology is defined as the theory of knowledge, what counts as valid knowledge and how do we decide. So again, epistemic is something to do with knowledge, epistemology is the theory of knowledge. In quantitative, the answer could be numbers. In qualitative, it could be people's experiences, right? What counts as valid knowledge in this context? How do we decide? Work will usually describe its epistemology. And epistemology can help inform operational definitions, right? Operational definitions are much more specific and can be informed by your epistemology. So in qualitative work, epistemology is made explicit and reflected on deliberately, as opposed to quantitative. It can be a little bit less so. We have our epistemology. Remember, the theory of knowledge. Ontology is how we conceptualize what is real or true. It's concerned with the nature of reality and existence. Again, qualitative research foregrounds and reflects on this more openly than quantitative. We see this a lot in qualitative research. There's a lot of reflection. Uh, yeah, so we have our epistemology, right? The theory of knowledge, what counts as valid knowledge, and how do we decide? Ontology, how do we conceptualize what is real or true? And reflexivity, this is the process of critically considering values, assumptions, expectations, choice, and actions during the research process, and how that influences research. So it's the expectation and the consideration of all of these different facets of the research process and how that can influence us and the research itself. This concept of reflexivity brings the research and the researcher and their lived experiences actively into the research process, shaping interpretation. Uh, Reflexivity as a principle of, of qualitative research challenges the illusion of neutrality. All research in qualitative is shaped by the researcher's perspective. Different researchers could come to different findings based on their lived experiences, for example. The key is simply considering who you are, what you bring to the table, how you can bring more to the perspective of the study. And we'll talk about this more below in positionality statements, but just remember for now, again, some key terminology. We're looking at epistemology, ontology, and reflexivity. Epistemology, the theory of knowledge, ontology being how we know and conceptualize what is real or true, and reflexivity is considering all these different key aspects of the research process, which in itself can be influenced by the researcher's lived experience. So we're going to elaborate on reflexivity just a little bit more here in positionality statements, like I said. Essentially, a positionality statement is an alert to the readers of potential biases in research, listing all the different social categories or groups that we belong to. You can write a positionality statement on behalf of a team of researchers. So for example, our speaker, she was researching, studying men's response to sexual violence, and she said, as a cisgender woman, she is an outsider to men's experiences, but also an insider as a student who navigated university life. This outsider versus insider terminology can be super important for detail and exploration. She identified her passions and her biases. She acknowledged history of white women and sexual violence prevention, needing an intersection. She mentioned that we need an intersectional lens when it comes to the view that we have on sexual violence, and she emphasized a use of social ecological framework, recognizing that prevention is influenced by the individual, things like that. So you're essentially, again, you're alerting the reader of all potential biases, the ins and the outs, how you come to this as an outsider, and how you have some experience as an insider, listing all the social categories you belong to, etc., etc. This is part of reflexivity. You want to write this in your studies qualitatively. It's not seen as a weakness. It's an increasing of transparency and strengthens your credibility. So, that's just a little section on reflexivity there. Indicators of research quality. What are some indicators of research quality in quantitative research? We're going to compare them to, again, we're going to compare quantitative and qualitative. So in quantitative, where we have rigor, qualitative, we have trustworthiness. So again, quantitative, it's more about going hard in the paint on rigorous data to determine why data is valid. Meanwhile, qualitative is more about the trustworthiness process and how people we've talked to can inform the notions that we're looking for. It's established through thoroughness and competence, and usually when it comes to trustworthiness, when it comes to talking to a bunch of people that can reinform the notion we're looking for, usually stop after we start hearing the same perspective over and over again because of data saturation. So we have that comparison, right? Quantitative rigor, qualitative trustworthiness, rigor being going hard in the paint for data collection, to determine why data is valid, while trustworthiness, the validity of the data comes through how many people we've talked to that can reinform the notion that we're looking for, emphasizing thoroughness and competence. In quantitative, we have reliability, while in qualitative, we have dependability. Reliability in quantitative research tells us That if you used a tool or a measure to measure a person, you'll find the same thing over and over again, making it reliable. Qualitative research, it's reliable in the sense that it's more dependable. It's about the depth. If we see the same thing across different people who have similar experiences, every now and then we can see this established through numbers. This is called inter-rater reliability. It's a metric of reliability in qualitative research, though it's used less frequent. But yeah, so we have rigor and trustworthiness for quantitative to qualitative, reliability to dependability, or again reliability. If you used a tool or a measure to be able to measure something over and over again reliably, with dependability being the depth and the application across different people, how dependable that is. Let's look at another one. In quantitative, we have validity, while in qualitative, we have credibility, right? Validity, as it caters to, in quantitative research, measuring something that we can claim to be measuring. It's measuring, if we're measuring empathy, we should be measuring it with associated things with empathy, right? Measuring something that we claim to be measuring using things that are related in its measurement. That's kind of like the quantitative equivalent, while the qualitative equivalent is credibility, right? Our validity is more so credibility. We don't want conclusions made once. We see the data, but more so, for example, documenting the process and how you get from step 1 to step 2. That can increase credibility. So again, when it comes to quantitative, we have rigor. Qualitative, we have trustworthiness, reliability. Or quantitative, we have reliability. Quantitative, we have rigor. Qualitative, we have trustworthiness. Quantitative, we have reliability. Qualitative, we have dependability. Quantitative, we have validity. Qualitative, we have credibility. And then finally, quantitative, we have generalizability, so we want to collect data that can reflect on wider populations. And qualitative, we have transferability. We think about how these studies might transfer across the board. The goal isn't to create something generalizable, but more about getting data on subgroups that we can transfer to better learn about people. So there's all these different kinds of comparisons. What are some examples of qualitative methods? Narrative inquiry, right? That's exploring people's stories, right? This is a method of qualitative research where we focus on people telling their stories and focus on how they tell them, not just the content. Sometimes we'll learn more when we talk to people for years, for example, to understand their stories and perspective and kind of learning about their behavior. We can also look at existing stories and study them. We don't always have to be talking to people directly. So that's a narrative inquiry qualitative method. We have a thematic analysis. This is identifying patterns across data. Talk to a lot of people, trying to find a lot of common experiences and meaning through interviews, lots of discussion, very iterative, not so focused on categorization, but establishing meaning behind experience. This is more common and collects a lot of data. Again, this is the thematic analysis and qualitative analysis, qualitative methods. So we've gone through narrative inquiry and thematic analysis. Now we have ethnography. This is a type of qualitative method where you immerse yourself in cultural subgroups. Going into a setting, observing what's happening, not necessarily intruding, but being part of the scene. If it's considered public, you don't need consent. We already talked about that. Usually you want to be in a setting for a long time and over a long time, because initially people will monitor their performance and behavior and behave in a certain way. People can only be performative for so long, though, and then you really get your data when it comes to ethnography. Again, you want to be in a setting for a long time, over a long time, just to really get at the data you're looking for. Again, really just becoming part of that environment. It can lead to biases, but there's a lot of benefit to this. Again, this is the ethnographic qualitative method. It's ethnography. Discourse analysis. This is studying language, talk, and text, looking at how people communicate, the words they use to understand the world. This is usually done with things like text and post. And finally, grounded theory, right? This is building theory from data. This can be pretty challenging. We don't really use this too much. It's gaining theory built by data and understanding. Essentially, you engage in research studies without a theory and you collect data to build that. It's not necessarily harking. It's relatively similar, but the ethics of it can be a little bit different in qualitative methodology. Yeah. So harking, if we remember, was misrepresenting exploratory findings as confirmatory. Doing your research and then taking that data and building a hypothesis off of it. Grounded theory is building a theory from data, so not the hypothesis. It's you essentially you go into data research, put yourself in another mindset as if you don't know what you know, you're not yourself, going into a deep research mode where you have no preconceived notion of anything. Yeah, and then you build a theory from that. It's a little hard to explain. Yeah. So, again, these different methods of qualitative data collection, these qualitative methods, we have narrative inquiry, or exploring people's stories. We have thematic analysis, or identifying patterns across data. We have ethnography, which is immersion in culture of social groups. We have discourse analysis, which is studying language, talk, and texts. And grounded theory, which is building theory from data. Yeah, so she told us about a couple of her studies. So she did this listening guide study where she used a snowballing sampling strategy where she recruited participants who recruited others that could provide insights. She did interviews, right? So essentially, she did a listening guide style, focusing on different layers of voice and meaning, where people read through data, or sorry, she and her group read through the data that they collected through these interviews, these snowball style sampled interviews 4 times, focusing on different layers. So reading 1, the initial interview, the initial reading, first impressions, kind of just documenting what you see comes up. So reading 1 is very much just about like getting the data going, kind of putting it in your head. Reading 2 was they were reviewing I poems. The participants made a bunch of I statements, I plus a few words, I like cats, I like dogs. Yeah, so. If I said the participants say that? No. So the participants were interviewed. Reading 2 was her and her team going through these interviews and making a list of I statements based on what the participants said. So if they said in their interview, I like cats, I like dogs, you would make that in a list. Reading 3 was another read where themes are analyzed across participants, what's being repeated by people and contrasted. Then everybody talks about it. And reading 4 is just reviewing the research question, how the data lines up with all of that. You can do more than 4 readings in the listening guide style, but they didn't. Yeah, so this is kind of a mix of discourse analysis and thematic analysis, right? It's a mix of discourse analysis because they're building theory. They're studying language, talks, things like that, and at the same time, it's they're identifying the patterns of language across the data. We saw that specifically in reading 3, right? They're looking at where themes are analyzed across participants, what's being repeated and contrasted. Yeah. So again, reading 1, initial overview. Reading 2, they made I poems. Reading 3, contrasting patterns, and what's checking repetition. Reading 4 was just an overall review and checking how data lines up, and this was all discourse analysis and thematic analysis. Then she did a photo voice experiment. So the purpose was to evaluate like wise guys training programs. So the data style was done through interviews and participant generated photos. Essentially, they wanted to garner opinions on a wise guys program. So they'd sit down with teens and ask them how the program was helping them out. It was awkward and they barely said anything. So the team went to photo voicing. Essentially, the participants were given a Polaroid camera and they took pictures of things that they felt reflected their lived experience. The guys were then talked to about their photos, and their pictures described that the guys felt restricted and didn't know what it meant to be a man, but the program was helping them out. In this, trust was developed to ensure that productivity and engagement with the research is accurate. But that's what the team did. So it was very much thematic analysis, again, analyzing patterns across all the guys, plus qualitative, kind of just qualitative descriptions. Yeah, so that was a pretty cool experiment. Yeah, so qualitative research is as valid as quantitative. It's strength aligned context, experience, nuance, and interpretation, and it encourages researchers to remain transparent, reflexive, and intentional in method choice. That is our overview of qualitative research. I will see you in the next one.